Georgia, October 2025. 310 days of defiance have transformed this small Caucasus nation into the epicenter of a growing ideological struggle. Crowds flood Tbilisi's Rustaveli Avenue night after night, waving Georgian, Ukrainian, and American flags under the pale glow of streetlights. They chant for Europe, not for Moscow. What began as opposition to a single piece of legislation, the so-called foreign agent law, has become something much larger, a nationwide rejection of Vladimir Putin's creeping influence, and a declaration that Georgia will not become another puppet state. The Foreign Agent Bill, introduced by the ruling Georgian Dream Party, requires any media or NGO receiving over 20% of its funding from abroad to register as serving foreign interests. To Western audiences, it echoes a familiar authoritarian pattern, one that Putin used in 2012 to strangle Russia's civil society. Georgian officials insist it's about transparency, but protesters see it as a slow-motion annexation. They know this playbook too well. For almost a year, demonstrations have continued, despite tear gas arrests and organized disinformation campaigns. Police brutality videos circulate online faster than censors can delete them. The faces leading these marches are young university students, independent journalists, and unemployed graduates. Many are part of a generation that never lived under Soviet rule yet carry its scars through their parents' memories. From a social perspective, this uprising exposes the inequality beneath Georgia's political landscape. The divide between the urban EU-oriented youth of Tbilisi and the rural regions, still dependent on Russian trade mirrors, the same fracture haunting Russia itself, between a corrupt elite clinging to Kremlin contracts and ordinary citizens who bear the cost of dependency. While oligarchs build glass towers, workers in Rustavi's shuttered factories ask why Moscow's economic grip continues to suffocate their futures. The protests' persistence also reflects a political fracture long underestimated by the West. For years, the Georgian Dream government survived by balancing between Moscow's intimidation and Brussels' patience. But after the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine and the economic chaos that followed, that balance snapped. The Georgian public, 80% of whom favor EU membership, saw neutrality as surrender. The party's betrayal became a symbol of systemic rot, a warning that democracy itself could be voted out of existence. In recent months, solidarity has grown beyond Georgia's borders. Pro-democracy activists from Armenia and Moldova have appeared at rallies waving signs that read, "Today Tbilisi, tomorrow Minsk." Western diplomats quietly note that this is no longer a domestic protest. It's a test case for how far Kremlin influence can reach without tanks. The ruling party's reaction reveals the depth of its fear. It accuses protesters of being agents of the CIA, Soros, or Ukrainian intelligence, an absurd mirror of Putin's rhetoric against his own citizens. But the repression has grown sophisticated. Instead of mass killings or disappearances, authorities now use soft pressure, freezing bank accounts, firing public employees, and threatening families with social service cuts. The state has learned that silence can be enforced not only with batons, but with bureaucracy. Still, every crackdown births new voices. The symbol of the resistance, former President Salome Zurabishvili, speaks to crowds in defiance of her dismissal, urging them to choose Europe, not fear. Her courage, echoed by thousands of mothers carrying candles for jailed students, keeps the movement alive. International analysts now call this Georgia's second independence struggle. It's no longer about one law, but about the right to define its future without Moscow's shadow. Western intelligence reports leaked in late September even suggest Russian advisors are now embedded within Georgian security agencies, guiding strategy to contain the protests. Confirmation that the Kremlin sees Georgia's defiance as contagious. And yet, despite intimidation, exhaustion, and winter approaching, the protesters return. Because to them, every night spent in the square is one night stolen from the empire that refuses to die. To understand why Georgia's resistance resonates so deeply, one must look back a century to a time when Russian soldiers first marched into Tbilisi, promising protection and delivering subjugation. The story of Georgia's modern defiance is inseparable from 100 years of struggle under Moscow's shadow. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, Georgia briefly tasted independence. For 4 fragile years, it functioned as a parliamentary democracy, trading wine to France and learning self-governance after centuries of imperial control. But in 1921, Lenin's Red Army invaded, crushing the young republic in a matter of weeks. Soviet archives later revealed that Moscow had signed a treaty recognizing Georgia's sovereignty just months before the attack, a familiar pattern of deceit that Ukrainians, Moldovans, and now Georgians know all too well. The 70 years that followed rewired Georgia's identity. The Orthodox Church was subordinated to Moscow, political purges decimated the intelligentsia, and Georgian soldiers were drafted to fight in distant Soviet wars they never understood. By the time independence was restored in 1991, Georgia's infrastructure was in ruins, its language marginalized, and its population divided between nostalgia for stability and hunger for freedom. That fragility set the stage for Moscow's next act. In the 1990s, as Russia descended into chaos, the Kremlin quietly backed separatist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Georgia's western and northern regions. Ostensibly framed as peacekeeping missions, these operations were early experiments in the hybrid warfare Russia would later unleash in Crimea and Donbass. They blended propaganda, proxy militias, and staged ethnic grievances to fracture a small democracy before it could solidify. In 2008, under Vladimir Putin's leadership, the mask fell off. Russian tanks crossed the border in what became the first full-scale invasion of the post-Soviet era. The world's attention was distracted by the Beijing Olympics. Western leaders issued statements, but stopped short of sanctions. Within days, the Georgian army was overwhelmed. Moscow recognized the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, effectively slicing off 1/5 of Georgia's territory. It was in hindsight the rehearsal for Ukraine. What Putin learned from that war was not military, but psychological. He realized that decisive force combined with Western hesitation could permanently reshape borders. In a chilling 2008 press conference, he dismissed the idea that Crimea could ever be contested, insisting Russia had no future goals. Yet less than 6 years later, he annexed Crimea, the same logic perfected. The scars of 2008 never healed. Families displaced from Gori and Tskinvali still live in prefabricated settlements, their fields separated from home by barbed wire and Russian patrols. Over time, this created a social wound, a generation growing up between exile and identity, raised in a country where freedom was both a memory and an aspiration. It's this generation now leading the protests in 2025. The 2008 war also birthed a demographic scar that quietly reshaped the nation. Tens of thousands of young men emigrated to Europe for work, depleting Georgia's rural labor force. Birth rates fell sharply, villages emptied out. Economists today warn that without sustained reform, Georgia's aging population could mirror Eastern Europe's decline, a slow erosion of vitality that no amount of foreign aid can reverse. Politically, the invasion entrenched cynicism. Many Georgians began to doubt whether the West would ever defend them. The 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest had promised that Georgia would one day become a member. But 17 years later, that promise remains a mirage. Russia exploited that disappointment, spreading the idea that Europe uses Georgia but never saves it. The propaganda resonated especially in poorer regions dependent on Russian trade and remittances. And yet history also forged resilience. Georgia's civic movements, student unions, and independent media have learned from decades of deception. They understand the cost of naivety. Their protests in 2025 are not spontaneous. They are the latest chapter in a century-long resistance to a neighbor that insists on calling domination brotherhood. Now, as protests continue, and Kremlin advisors whisper strategies into Tbilisi's corridors of power, one question echoes from the past. How many times must Georgia fight for independence before the world truly believes it deserves one? When the smoke of the 2008 war cleared, the Kremlin realized that territorial conquest was only one path to control. Political infiltration was cheaper and subtler. That's when Bidzina Ivanishvili entered the stage. A billionaire who made his fortune in post-Soviet Russia, Ivanishvili was the perfect Trojan horse, wealthy, influential, and loyal to the networks that thrived under Putin's shadow economy. In 2012, he founded the Georgian Dream Party, promising stability, prosperity, and a balanced relationship between East and West. Within months, he was prime minister. Within years, his party had become the state itself. From the beginning, the Dream's political strategy mirrored Russia's. It fused populist nationalism with quiet dependence on Moscow's markets and loans. Churches preached traditional values, while local TV networks aired Russian-produced dramas glorifying unity between brother nations. Behind the curtain, oligarchic money-financed campaigns that demonized critics as Western puppets. The opposition was not destroyed overnight. It was slowly delegitimized, discredited, and starved. International observers noticed the pattern. By 2016, Freedom House had downgraded Georgia's democracy rating, citing rising corruption and political interference in the judiciary. By 2020, Reporters Without Borders ranked Georgia below Moldova in press freedom, accusing authorities of using surveillance and intimidation against independent journalists. And by 2024, Georgia's political ecosystem looked eerily similar to Russia's in the early 2010s, competitive on paper, captive in practice. The Georgian Dream's genius was its ability to wrap repression in procedural legitimacy. Elections were held, ballots counted, and foreign observers invited, but the outcomes were pre-engineered. State resources were funneled into patronage networks. Construction firms loyal to the party won lucrative contracts, while small business owners who refused to donate faced tax investigations. Rural mayors were quietly told that EU-friendly rhetoric could cost them their funding. The Orthodox Church became an indispensable ally. Patriarch Ilya II, revered as a near saint among Georgians, rarely criticized the government, but frequently warned against Western decadence. In a deeply religious society, this moral framing turned European integration from a political choice into a cultural threat. The Kremlin's soft power had never needed missiles. It needed pulpits. From a social perspective, Ivanishvili's rise deepened inequality across Georgia. The billionaire class consolidated wealth in Tbilisi's elite districts, while regions like Guria and Samtskhe Javaketi saw rising unemployment. Labor migration to Turkey, Poland, and Germany surged, a brain drain that hollowed out small towns and fueled resentment against foreign-funded elites. Ironically, the very laws the government used to attack NGOs for taking Western money ignored the billions siphoned offshore by its own officials. By 2022, as Russia invaded Ukraine, the mask slipped. The Georgian Dream refused to join Western sanctions against Moscow. Government spokesmen justified it as economic pragmatism, but leaked diplomatic cables later revealed that Kremlin-linked investors had threatened to pull out of Georgian energy and banking sectors if sanctions were imposed. The policy kept gas flowing, but morally bankrupted the administration. That same year, Kremlin advisors quietly began drafting a familiar piece of legislation, a foreign agent law. By 2023, it was ready for trial, nearly word for word, identical to the one Putin had passed in 2012. The first attempt triggered massive protests and was withdrawn, but the government's retreat was tactical, not sincere. When the EU granted Georgia candidate status later that year, the ruling party revived the bill, hoping Western fatigue over Ukraine would allow it to slip through unnoticed. From a political perspective, this move signaled more than domestic repression. It was the institutional capture of a nation. Analysts from the European Council on Foreign Relations warned that Georgia was sleepwalking into authoritarianism. Yet what made this development particularly dangerous was its hybrid nature. The dream government maintained enough democratic veneer to claim legitimacy, while hollowing out all mechanisms of accountability. In essence, Georgia had become Putin's quiet victory, not annexed by tanks, but by contracts, clergy, and corruption. The 2024 election would soon reveal how far that transformation had gone. The phrase foreign agent law may sound bureaucratic, but in post-Soviet history, it has been the death certificate of democracy. First applied in Russia in 2012, it marked the end of independent journalism, NGOs, and free political life. By 2022, Vladimir Putin had expanded its reach to label anyone from environmentalists to war widows as potential spies. When the Georgian Dream Party reintroduced this same law in 2023, it was not a coincidence. It was an imitation. The law's mechanics were deceptively simple. Any organization receiving more than 20% of its funds from abroad had to register as an agent of foreign influence. Its real purpose, however, was psychological: to stigmatize dissent, to turn the word Western into enemy. In Russia, this tactic successfully broke solidarity within civil society. In Georgia, it sparked rage. Tens of thousands took to the streets chanting "No to Russian law." Protesters carried placards showing Putin's face crossed out beside the slogan, "We are Europe." The timing was revealing. Moscow was desperate for a symbolic victory, as its war in Ukraine dragged into a third year under mounting losses. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Donald Trump's administration had recalibrated U.S. foreign aid, reducing direct democracy funding in Eastern Europe, while focusing on trade leverage and anti-China containment. This shift left a vacuum in regions like Georgia, one the Kremlin was eager to fill. Analysts from BBC and Reuters noted that the reintroduction of the bill came shortly after high-level meetings between Georgian and Russian energy executives. Behind closed doors, deals were being struck to secure discounted Russian gas through 2027 in exchange for policy coordination. That coordination, Western diplomats now say, included the adoption of repressive legislation. From a political perspective, the move represented the culmination of a long campaign to erode civic resistance without overt violence. Instead of tanks, the Kremlin exported laws. Instead of propaganda leaflets, it used telegram channels and deepfake videos portraying protesters as drug addicts and Western-funded degenerates. By mid-2024, these digital operations had reached sophisticated levels. One disinformation clip falsely showed U.S. Marines landing in Batumi, viewed over 5 million times before being debunked. Yet repression only deepened defiance. For Georgia's youth, this was no longer about EU membership, it was existential. "They want to erase our future," said a 23-year-old protester interviewed by Deutsche Welle. "If this law passes, there will be no independent journalists left, no truth, no country." The Dream government insisted it was merely protecting national sovereignty. But internal memos leaked to OC Media revealed explicit coordination with Kremlin legal advisors during the bill's drafting phase. Georgian officials even consulted Russian constitutional lawyers, the same ones who helped design the Kremlin's censorship frameworks. International reaction was swift. Brussels froze portions of Georgia's pre-accession funding, and European Parliament members warned that the country risked losing its candidate status. But the Georgian Dream Party, emboldened by economic deals with Moscow and Chinese infrastructure loans, dismissed the criticism as Western hypocrisy. From a social angle, this confrontation illuminated the widening gulf between Georgia's ruling elite and its citizens. Polls conducted by National Democratic Institute in early 2025 showed that 82% of Georgians still supported EU membership, while only 7% wanted closer ties with Russia. Yet the government, driven by oligarchic self-preservation, continued its pivot eastward. The social contract was broken. Those in power no longer served the people but the networks that sustained them. The demographic cost of this drift is already visible. According to the World Bank, emigration from Georgia rose by 20% in 2024, with the majority being young professionals in IT, finance, and medicine, the same group vital for the country's modernization. This exodus mirrors Russia's own brain drain crisis, illustrating a regional phenomenon where authoritarian politics push talent abroad faster than economies can replace it. The Foreign Agent Law passed its first reading in late 2024, triggering a week of the largest protests since independence. Riot police responded with water cannons and mass arrests. Yet the images broadcast globally drenched students holding European flags galvanized international sympathy. To many outside observers, Georgia had become a front line of democracy's global recession, a small state fighting to preserve its voice in an era when laws, not armies, silenced nations. But inside the country, fear was setting in. Civic organizations began closing preemptively, journalists encrypted their data, and professors warned students to avoid public activism. The Kremlin's model had been transplanted successfully, repression through legality. And as one activist whispered to reporters, "We are now living Russia's 2012, but the world has fewer excuses to look away." The October 2024 parliamentary election was meant to be Georgia's democratic turning point. Instead, it became the spark for the largest political crisis since independence. Videos soon surfaced online, unidentified men stuffing multiple ballots into transparent boxes while police officers looked away. The ruling Georgian Dream Party emerged with a narrow majority, a victory as suspicious as it was swift. Within hours, opposition leaders called for investigations. Within days, the streets of Tbilisi were flooded once again. President Salome Zurabishvili, long at odds with the pro-Russian government, declared that she would not recognize the results, citing a systematic pattern of fraud. Her defiance was short-lived. Parliament, controlled by Georgian Dream loyalists, convened an emergency session, declared her position vacant due to constitutional violations, and installed a party-approved replacement. It was a textbook constitutional coup, silent, bureaucratic, and devastatingly effective. From a political perspective, this was the moment when facade collapsed into farce. Western diplomats condemned the move, but their statements carried little weight. The European Union warned that Georgia's candidate status was now under review. President Trump's administration in Washington offered restrained concern, emphasizing sovereignty first, while prioritizing energy deals and regional anti-China alignment over democratic promotion. The Kremlin celebrated quietly. Georgia was no longer an unpredictable neighbor, but a subdued satellite. In November, just 1 month later, the government suspended all talks with the European Union until 2028. For a nation where 80% of the population identifies as pro-European, this was an act of collective betrayal. Overnight, the promise of integration vanished, replaced by a sense of despair and outrage. Tens of thousands poured into the capital once again. The protests spread beyond Tbilisi, Batumi, Kutaisi, Gori cities and towns united under one slogan, "We are not Russia." But unlike earlier demonstrations, this new wave was different. It was decentralized, digitally coordinated, and fiercely persistent. Activists used encrypted channels like Telegram and Signal to bypass government surveillance. Anonymous groups such as Free Georgia Network emerged, disseminating real-time information about police movements, safe zones, and live streams. Many of these organizers were part of the Georgian diaspora in Germany, Poland, and the United States young professionals who had left years earlier but still viewed their homeland as worth saving. From a social lens, this evolution reflects the resilience of digital resistance in a repressive environment. While state-controlled television labeled protesters as foreign agents, social media turned into an uncensored parliament. Georgian TikTok creators posted daily from protest zones, turning raw footage into viral testimonies. A single clip showing riot police beating elderly women reached 12 million views across platforms within 24 hours, far beyond the reach of any government narrative. The demographic consequences were profound. The prolonged crisis intensified youth emigration. Thousands of students left for Europe seeking safety and opportunity, while remittances became Georgia's economic lifeline. Economists from the London School of Economics now warn of a looming demographic vacuum, with the country losing up to 1.5% of its working-age population annually, the same rate as war-torn Ukraine. This human outflow weakens not only the economy, but also the very movement fighting for change. Our brightest are leaving, said one university rector in Tbilisi. The ones who stay will carry both the dream and the burden. Still, protest momentum persisted. Every arrest brought two new voices to the streets. Artists began painting murals of Zurabishvili's silhouette with the words, "She spoke truth," under bridges and overpasses. Police painted over them each night. Students repainted them each morning. The battle had become cultural, a war of endurance rather than confrontation. International coverage increased. BBC and Al Jazeera documented the use of facial recognition drones and imported Russian crowd control technology. Investigations revealed that the government had quietly purchased spyware systems from a Chinese manufacturer under the guise of urban monitoring. European Parliament resolutions followed, but sanctions remained symbolic. The Georgian dream knows Brussels won't risk losing another ally in the Caucasus, commented a former EU envoy. The state's response relied on attrition. Rather than mass imprisonment, authorities imposed short-term detentions, 2 weeks here, 10 days there, enough to exhaust the movement without creating martyrs. The same approach had once tamed protests in Russia and Belarus, yet beneath the repression cracks appeared. Whistleblowers leaked documents suggesting that Kremlin advisors were embedded in Georgia's security apparatus, advising on crowd control and information suppression. Public trust in the police collapsed. Even some rank-and-file officers began refusing orders. By early 2025, the protests entered their 11th month. No clear leader, no clear end, just a collective determination to resist becoming another Russian protectorate. What started as outrage over one law had evolved into a referendum on Georgia's future. The people's question was simple but defiant. If democracy can be taken without a single bullet fired, can it still be called democracy at all? By October 2025, the nightly protests in Tbilisi had become a ritual of endurance. Thousands still gathered at Freedom Square, not expecting immediate victory, but refusing surrender. Each evening began with hymns, orthodox chants reimagined as songs of resistance, and ended with candlelight vigils for the arrested and the exiled. Georgia's fight had evolved into something quieter, deeper, and far more consequential than anyone first imagined, a struggle to preserve a nation's soul against the slow suffocation of authoritarian drift. The Georgian Dream Party remained in power, but its legitimacy was fractured. What had begun as political theater had become a battle of attrition between a ruling elite and its people. The state tightened its grip. New laws restricted foreign media access, tax audits targeted NGOs and visa rules were quietly amended to discourage journalists from entering. Yet every restriction triggered a new act of defiance. This was the new face of modern repression, clean, procedural, and deniable. As Professor Michael Clark of King's College London observed in his spring 2025 report, Georgia is witnessing a postmodern authoritarianism, one that uses legality as its instrument of control, rather than violence as its spectacle. The Kremlin could not have designed it better. From a political perspective, the Georgian crisis became a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of Western influence. Trump's Washington had shifted to a transactional diplomacy focusing on energy corridors and countering China's Belt and Road expansion through the Caucasus. Under this new paradigm, democracy promotion faded into background noise. Moscow understood this perfectly. With American moral pressure diminished and EU leverage constrained by energy dependency, the Georgian Dream Party faced no serious external deterrent. But while foreign governments hesitated, Georgia's civil society adapted. Activists built encrypted databases to document human rights abuses and preserve protest footage against deletion. Digital memory vaults modeled after Ukraine's wartime archives stored evidence of arbitrary arrests and property seizures. International NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International partnered with local journalists to authenticate this material, a new form of defensive journalism for a state drifting into autocracy. From a social angle, the divisions between city and countryside widened dangerously. Rural regions where Russian-language media dominates increasingly viewed protesters as westernized radicals threatening stability. Disinformation networks, some traced by Reuters to Moscow's GRU cyber units, flooded Georgian social platforms with manipulated footage portraying demonstrators as violent anarchists. Meanwhile, Tbilisi's middle class, burdened by inflation and job insecurity, began to tire. Supermarket prices had risen 23% since late 2024, largely due to supply disruptions from Russia's shifting export policies. The regime's greatest ally was not ideology, it was exhaustion, and yet resistance persisted. A new underground movement, the Generation of '91, named after the year Georgia regained independence, began coordinating strikes among teachers, railway workers, and hospital staff. It spread through encrypted chats and anonymous manifestos uploaded to social media. Though small, these acts of civil disobedience signaled something Moscow feared most: the moral contagion of defiance spreading across the region. From a demographic perspective, Georgia's future now stands on a knife's edge. The country's population, once nearly 5 million, has shrunk to 3.5 million. The median age is rising while the birth rate has fallen to one of the lowest in Eastern Europe. The World Bank projects that by 2040, Georgia's working-age population could decline by a quarter. The exodus of skilled labor engineers, IT professionals, doctors mirrors Russia's own demographic crisis, a double loss that weakens both the Kremlin's empire and its reluctant satellites. This slow bleed of youth and talent creates what demographers call a generational deficit. The people who could rebuild democracy are leaving, while those who remain must sustain both economic production and political resistance. As one young protester told The Guardian, "Our parents fought for independence. We're fighting to stop it from dying in silence. International attention has waned, but inside Georgia, the struggle has matured. What began as a movement against one law has become a national awakening, an assertion that democracy cannot survive without citizens willing to risk comfort for principle." Even as water cannons roll down Rustaveli Avenue, the chant remains the same: Sakartvelo is not for sale. Experts warn that the Kremlin's strategy in Georgia may soon be replicated elsewhere. Moldova's fragile coalition faces similar pressures. Armenia drifts closer to Moscow out of security dependence. and Central Asian republics are quietly tightening foreign influence regulations inspired by both Moscow and Tbilisi. The playbook works unless resisted early. Still, Georgia's defiance offers hope. Its young protesters, armed with smartphones and memory, have shown that autocracy can be fought with endurance as much as revolution. They may not win tomorrow or next month, but they have ensured that when history writes this chapter, Georgia will not be remembered as Putin's silent conquest, but as the nation that refused to bow. Georgia's 310-day uprising against the Kremlin-backed Georgian Dream Party has become more than a protest. It is a historic referendum on sovereignty. From the century-long scars of Russian domination to the rise of oligarchic capture under Bidzina Ivanishvili, the struggle reveals how democracy can be dismantled through legality, not war. The reintroduction of the foreign agent law and the fraudulent 2024 elections pushed the country to the brink, yet also birthed a resilient digital resistance. Viewed through social, political, and demographic lenses, Georgia embodies the broader battle between autocracy and self-determination in post-Soviet space. It shows how inequality fuels unrest, how censorship evolves into administrative repression, and how demographic collapse threatens the future of free nations. As 2025 ends, the outcome remains uncertain. But one truth endures Georgia's courage: its refusal to accept silence has redefined what it means to fight for democracy in an age where freedom is eroded not by bullets, but by bureaucrats.